so many of our streets, housing estates, play parks, forests, beaches. The litter is there. It's evident.
As of 2015, there was 6.3 billion tonnes of plastic waste generated.
That's obviously a disaster for the environment, and particularly if it gets into the marine environment.
Plastic is turning up on our beaches on a daily basis. You can go down and just pick up bags of plastic. There's two places that the plastic comes from. They either comes from people coming down and using the beach and leaving things behind them, or it could be anything, and it could come from any country.
Several weeks ago, Nusa Penida in Bali was teeming with plastic garbage. It's terrible.
I mean, I've seen the unbelievable amount of plastic that you get on beaches.
I was in Gabon in West Africa last year, and I think those are the worst beaches I've ever seen. You're literally knee deep in old clothes and plastic bottles.
Anything that's putting a river in the hinterland, whatever that can be, chemicals, plastics, any sort of rubbish, that will eventually end up at the coast and on the beaches.
The oceans have currents, so plastic pollution can come from almost anywhere.
There are several big gyres. Most of the world's ocean currents move as a series of these rotating gyres, and they of course pick up anything that's moving on the surface, and they concentrate it towards the centre of the gyre. And several of them are enormously big, and they do make their way right across the Pacific. Accumulation size of Texas in the Central Pacific, where these floating plastics have accumulated and form just a continuous sort of slick of plastic.
I was talking with two mums here in the town, and they were saying that how shocked they had been recently on a trip to the States, where everything required for a meal was disposable and thrown away because the person that was the guest or the host was so time poor that they didn't feel they had time to wash dishes or deal with that.
Well, we have become a very kind of consumer and disposable country.
But we have now entered a world where convenience and things are built now with built-in obsolescence, so things are built to be thrown away and replaced.
I mean, one of the problems with Strangford Lough, it got fished incredibly heavily. So there were beds and beds covered with horse mussels. And the horse mussels lived for about 60 years or 80 years. Once they scraped it to get out the queen scallops, they all disappeared. There's no recovery of that queen scallop populations. And there's very little recovery of the horse mussel beds.
Discovered now that 1 in 3 fish that's caught for human consumption contains plastic.
Well, I remember not so long ago everybody was told you had to eat 3 portions of however much it was of fish a week, and now they're telling you to eat 1 portion of fish a week because they're so contaminated by microplastics.
It affects from the smallest zooplankton to the largest whale, and fin whales in the Mediterranean actually ingest about 2,000 bits of microplastic per day.
Microplastics snuck into toothpaste and shower gel and all kinds of things that you just don't need them in. Their impact on the environment has been so massive.
The microplastics become part of the sediment, a similar size to a sand grain, and I've heard in beaches in the world where microplastics make up a sizable proportion of the sand grains.
But what's emerging now is even more troubling, is that those microbeads actually attract other pollutants around them.
The microplastics in the beach are, of course, got different properties from the natural sand that's there. If plastics contain toxic elements and so on, those are going to be ingested by the creatures that are otherwise eating the sand and the materials that are within the sand. I saw a photograph once of a little microorganism floating in the ocean. There's a little thing called a copepod, and almost all of its body was taken up with a piece of microplastic that it had swallowed.
We have moved into this new geological era called the Anthropocene. But one of the ways that they're identifying this was a layer of plastic in the sediments.
One of the most evident things that you see is nets tangled up in the coral. There's also the risk that some of the wildlife that lives around the reef, turtles for example, will get caught in that.
I saw some large pieces of plastic caught on top of branching coral. The coral could not get enough sunlight, so their zooxanthellae could not photosynthesize. The coral will die.
It's a wow the first time you see coral. There are these gardens full of colour and textures and beautiful shapes. And
I went out to the outer part of the Great Barrier Reef, and it was absolutely beautiful. You know, just meadows, if you like, of coral, and lots of brightly coloured fish. A really spectacular view.
Coral reef is a much more complicated system, but the most important, I suppose, part of the system is the coral, because it provides the material which builds the physical structure.
I saw corals, which are stunningly beautiful, and color was everywhere, massive, spreading onto the submerged rocks. It really was like a flower garden in the ocean.
In the Caribbean, they had problems with some diseases that were affecting corals. There's some quite dramatic sort of photographic evidence of this sort of flourishing, beautiful sort of reef garden in the 1970s, and then by the 1980s it's this sort of greeny brown dead zone.
If you go out to sea from the west coast of Ireland, where a lot of the deep water corals are, they're on that edge of the continental shelf in 200 metres down to 3,000. They've been very severely impacted by fishing for a fish called orange ruffy. When they first discovered them, they started dredging or trawling with big nets down there. But in doing that, they also smashed all the coral reef.
coral reefs will be one of the first things we lose when temperatures rise.
It's not so much the amount of change, albeit that obviously is important, but what is I think more important is the rate of change.
In northwest Bali, there was massive coral destruction due to the irresponsible fishing activity, which used bombs and cyanide.
And unless we do something very soon with our single-use plastic and our other wastes, our oceans are in trouble.
In developing countries, they have traditionally produced a lot less waste, and they still produce less waste than we do, but as their populations rise and they also consume more, they produce more waste. And in many countries there is no waste management system.
There are ways to find alternatives to plastics and use things that are degradable. You know, I think we could regulate the use of plastics in many ways as well. For example, my son's living in Germany right now, and there they have a levy of 25 cents on every plastic bottle. So you don't find plastic bottles lying in the street anymore. There's always somebody there to pick it up.
So we've come up with a Plastic Smart campaign in our council on the North Coast, and the idea is to particularly encourage people to cut down on their single-use plastics.
For some of the microplastics, like microbeads, there's a really quick regulatory win, like just don't put them in there anymore.
I think actually there is a lot of hope, and I think that, you know, if you look, you know, Kenya has just recently banned plastic bags totally. Perhaps more actually in the sort of global south.
My government are attempting to eliminate plastic use and also recycle plastic garbage. But really, in my opinion, it's a waste of time if everybody and everyone does not help. We need to increase people's awareness to make a difference instead of waiting for a change in government policy. After all, we are all responsible.
But you know, I mean, I'm quite optimistic too. I do think the whole of human knowledge that's been accumulated for thousands of years and used to be the preserve of just a few specialists here and there, we've now got access to that. Everybody's got access to that. So, you know, I think that's going to then change humanity in the next 20 years, in the next 50.